Well, during your kind of period of training as a Salvation Army officer, part of what you have to learn is Salvation Army history. Did you have to do any Salvation Army history classes yet for your territorial envoyship training? You had to read a lot, yeah. Well, and we all pick up little bits of information, little bits of history of the Salvation Army, and we all know certain stories about how the Salvation Army began, certain places, certain people, and so on. And there are locations that are just kind of in our memory within the Salvation Army. Now, if this is new to you, you're going to go away today saying, I've learned something today, because you're going to learn a little bit of Salvation Army history. One of the places that is mentioned within the history of the Salvation Army, a place where Christ was boldly proclaimed, was on the streets in the East End of London, in Whitechapel, outside of a pub called the Blind Beggar. Yeah, the Blind Beggar. Now, some of you are going to say, oh, I've not heard of that before. Well, there we go. This is the little bit of history that you've learned today. A pub in the East End of London on Whitechapel Road called the Blind Beggar. The pub is hundreds of years old. It's still standing. It's not open today. But we are. Yeah. But it's standing outside this pub. Now, this pub is called the Blind Beggar, and actually the name of it, I'd love to think it was something to do with the story that we've read, but actually the name of it is to do with a gentleman in the 13th century by the name of Henry de Montfort, and he was fighting another kind of battle, and he lost his eye. And lost his sight, actually, and his kind of gentry, his position of gentry kind of went down, and he wound up being a beggar in the streets, and he would beg in that location, and that's why that pub eventually was called the Blind Beggar. But I have to imagine William Booth, one of the founders of the Salvation Army, when he stood outside of that pub, he would have used the name of it to his advantage, and he would have had opportunities to speak about this story about blind, is it Bartimaeus or is it Bartimaeus? I never remember. I'm going to say Bartimaeus for today. You might say Bartimaeus. And he would proclaim this story, I'm sure, about this blind beggar who cried out for mercy to the Lord and received his sight. And not just his physical sight, but his spiritual sight also. The journey of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospel of Mark, as we've been working through these last few months, we're getting towards the end of the Gospel now, just a reminder to keep on reading it through, so by the time we come to Easter, we'll have read every verse within the Gospel of Mark. This journey of Jesus that's recorded in this Gospel is coming to a culmination in Jerusalem. The pace is picking up, and Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem with his disciples. He's going to go via Jericho in a moment. But as he's heading that way, once again, we find his disciples squabbling for attention, for power, perhaps even for their own glory. And they've got a question for Jesus. James and John, these two brothers, they have a question for Jesus. And Jesus says to them, what is it you want me to do for you? That's an interesting question he asks, because he's going to ask that again in just a moment. What is it that you want me to do for you? And they say, we want a position of power in your kingdom. We want one of us to sit on your right and one to sit on your left. That's what we want you to do for us. And Jesus says, well, you don't really know what you're asking. You don't know what you're asking when you ask such questions. And they don't. It doesn't seem to be that they get that request granted. But they continue further down the road and they come to Jericho on their way. And as they are walking through the streets of Jericho, there is a blind beggar, at least one, maybe there are more, because it was a pilgrim way, who would sit at the roadside seeking mercy from people. Financially, really, is what they were looking for, that they may gain something from those who walked by. Now, this man in this story, Bartimaeus or Bartimaeus, it's interesting that we know his name, because most of the people that Jesus healed, we don't know their names. We don't know their names, they just are characters in the story, but this one we do. Perhaps it's because he was well known already, or perhaps it is because he became well known afterwards because he followed Jesus. Doubtless all those others whose names we don't know, their names are written in the book of life, each and every one known to God. But we do know that this blind man must have known who Jesus was. He must have heard the stories of this miracle worker. And he must have also reflected on the ministry of Jesus and concluded that this was the long-awaited for Messiah, This was the Christ that they were expecting. And the thought of the Messiah passing by this blind man must have stirred something deep within his heart, because in his mind he would have thought, this Messiah is going to be the one that Isaiah prophesied about, who would bring release to the captives, who would proclaim the good news, and who would restore the sight of the blind. And so he calls out, Jesus, son of David. That's a messianic term relating to King David, the one who'd come. Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, he shouted. And he didn't just do it once. He shouted it again and again and again. Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. He was persistent in his calling. He kept on crying out to Jesus, have mercy. Even though those around him tried to silence him, he kept on going. Jesus, have mercy on me. This perhaps seems like a good pattern of prayer for us. In our own simple prayer life and devotion, these phrases that have been used for many, many years, Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. A simple prayer, simply prayed. And not necessarily in a loud way, not necessarily shouting, but softly and quietly, as we contemplate our place before God and the mercy and the grace that we receive from him. Because in our prayers, we can believe that Jesus will do for us as he did for this blind beggar. And not necessarily, I'm talking about a physical healing, but as we read the story, what do we see that Jesus does? He stops. He stands still. He listens. And then he calls. Can this be the same for us too? In our prayers, when we cry out to God, Lord, have mercy, can it be that Jesus stops? He stands still. He listens. And then he calls us into a deeper relationship with him. The story of Bartimaeus continues. The crowd say to him, cheer up, on your feet. He's calling you. Here's the call of the kingdom. He's calling you. Come on, up you get. This Jesus is calling you. And up Bartimaeus gets. He responds with incredible enthusiasm as he runs towards Jesus. He flings off his coat and he runs towards the one in whom he believes. Let me take just a moment of what I mean when I talk about calling. You see, another thing within the Salvation Army, we often speak about calling, and often it's related to kind of going into full-time ministry. But that's not the case, because Jesus calls each and every one of us. He calls each and every one of us to follow him. Come, follow me, he says. Come, be my disciple. This is the call of the kingdom for each one of us. And it is true. It's true that he still calls people into full-time ministry, but he still calls each and every one of us every day to follow him. The call of the kingdom to live as kingdom people. And so on hearing this call, the man jumps to his feet, throws away what little he possesses, a simple cloak, quite different to the story we looked at last week about the rich young man who couldn't get rid of anything to follow Jesus. Well, this blind beggar has very little and he gets rid of it and follows Jesus. And then Jesus asks the same question that he previously asked the disciples. What do you want me to do for you? No assumption. He just simply asks, what is it that you want me to do for you? Teacher, I want to see, came the reply. His deepest need, his deepest concern, not that of a position of power or glory, but something far deeper. Teacher, I want to see. I want to see. And immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus along the road. I can't help but wonder if there's anyone else in that crowd beside the blind beggar, whether begging themselves or just part of the crowd who were walking down the road, who also received their sight. Not physical sight, But their spiritual side, that moment, they also heard the call of the kingdom, and they saw who Jesus was and followed him. And what about us today? Disciples called to follow Jesus. What about us today? Do we let Jesus pass along the road? Or do we do all that we can to cry out to him, Lord, have mercy, listen to my prayer? Are we persistent in our prayer? Or do we tell ourselves to be quiet? Do we still hear him calling us today? Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling. He continues to call today. Well, I wonder, in the strange reality that we live in right now, I wonder, what do you think about Jesus? How are you feeling about Jesus? What do you think about Jesus right now? Can you still hear someone say to you, cheer up on your feet. He's calling you. He's still calling you. This is the reality that we have. And so may that be so. May each one of us, by faith, be filled to the full measure of Christ, to have our eyes opened to see him, to have our ears opened to hear him, and to have our mouths opened that we may speak about him. I want to take just a minute or two for us to reflect and to pray. Vicky's going to play a piece of music, a tune called Saved by Grace, and the words will be on the screen. Let me just read some of these words while Vicky's playing. So we're not going to do anything but just listen, look, take a time to pray for yourself. Where you are, by all means, if you want to come and stand and pray here, you're welcome to do that. You're welcome to do that. But just know, Jesus is still calling you. He's still there. And when we cry out, Lord, have mercy, he stops. He stands still, he listens, and he calls us into a deeper relationship with him. Those first disciples of the Lord received the promise of his word, and in their lives such power did dwell to speed the message they should tell to all mankind that Jesus lives, and grace to each believer gives. Oh, may that same grace inspire today to live for Christ, the life and the way. Our deeds must ever match our creed. Then God our way will truly lead. As when those first disciples heard and boldly trusted God's great word. Oh, listen to this prayer. If we believed as they believed, great grace would hallow every deed. Light would be ours, his truth to know, and send us forth his love to show. Just make your own silent prayer just now. And so, Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. Amen. Amen. Dear friends, you know that so many of us pray for you each week in all sorts of different ways. And do know that you can contact us at any time. If there are particular prayer requests that you have, speak through your cell groups, contact us in the office, and know that we will pray for you. And just a reminder, there are still plenty of special moments to pray in the coming days as we open for private prayer over the next few weeks. But may you be blessed to know that Jesus is listening to you. He's stopping and he's listening to you, and he continues to call you into a deeper relationship with him.